Hey everyone, I'm Frenzy the Killbot, and welcome to Kerbal Space Program. I got a special request to do some more KSP videos, and at the time the KSP2 trailer had just dropped, so I thought this would be a fun project to work on. I do want to mention before we get started that I'm still on version 1.3, which means there's quite a few major updates that I don't have. I won't have all the cool new features. But that's okay because the main stuff is all still the same. So I've done one other KSP video so far, and that was a pretty basic moon mission. And that's because at the time, I had never gone past the moons. Never gone outside the Kerbal system. Since then I've played a bit more, practiced a whole bunch, and finally gone interplanetary with a successful mission to Duna. Duna being the Mars equivalent in the KSP galaxy. This time we're going to go somewhere I haven't been before. We are going to go to Dres. And there's no exact equivalent in our solar system, but it's basically Ceres, which is the largest asteroid in the asteroid belt. This is also going to be a much more complicated mission, but we'll get to that in a second. First off, what lucky timing. We are about 2 weeks away, 15 days, from the Dres transfer window. And since this is going to be more complicated, we need to get started right away. So let's take a look at Phase 1. Phase 1 is going to be setting up a communications network, so that everything that comes afterwards is able to still talk to Mission Command. So we're going to send some pretty basic comms satellites, nothing too special about these. We're going to send 4 of them attached to this deployment hub, and this thing is going to be able to take care of all the maneuvering and adjusting necessary to set up the network. And we'll get into more of the specifics of what that entails in the next video. This thing is going to go on the top of a fairly big rocket. And at this point I want to mention that I named this mission the Hera mission, which is the wrong Greek goddess to use, but I wanted something that went along with Ares, which I shamelessly ripped off the Martian for my Mars mission. But anyways, let's get this thing going in 3, 2, 1, blast off. So for anyone who watched my first Kerbal video, you'll probably notice that there's a lot more stuff on the screen. As well as practicing more, I've also upped my mod game, so a lot of these buttons and windows are mods that I've found to be quite helpful. People familiar with Kerbal Space Program will probably recognize that I have MechJeb up. And MechJeb is a popular but kind of divisive mod. It is basically a flight computer that you can use to automate pretty much everything in the game, to be honest. It can do launches and landings. It will plan and execute maneuvers. It will control the orientation of your ships. And some people kind of consider this cheating, because really it can kind of play the game for you. Personally, I don't think it's that unreasonable. Especially in the later stages of the game, to have a flight computer you can depend on to do some of the busy work. And for LPing, it's actually quite good because it minimizes the amount of time you have to spend jumping to the map screen and fiddling around with the maneuver planner. So that's one of the reasons I use it here. When I'm playing by myself, I do use it sometimes, but usually not as much. And one thing I never let MechJeb do is actually fly my launches, because I think that launching a rocket is actually one of the more fun parts of the game. It's really nice to sort of validate your design to actually fly it up into orbit. Now, that being said, as much fun as I find flying rockets, I know that it's not as much fun to watch. So I will be trying to speed up a lot of this stuff whenever possible, just so that we're not wasting too much time watching a rocket go up. And there we go. We're now in a stable 150 kilometer orbit. That's sort of the altitude I'm going to be using for staging this mission. No real reason, I like it. Now, those of you, again, who watched my first Kerbal video know that I like not leaving things in orbit. I don't like space junk, so I tend to plan and design my lower stages to actually deorbit themselves. This one I did a little bit differently than what I did in my first video, which is that I just planned to have a little bit extra fuel and added a control module and some batteries onto this launch stage. So all we need to do with it is swing it around so it's pointing retrograde and then burn. It has way more than enough fuel. Some of that is just sort of margin of error for my launch, because I don't always do those well. But yeah, once this thing sort of slowly gets pointed in mostly the right direction, we'll just burn and that'll be it. And that was even too much of a burn. You really only have to get it below 25 kilometers for it to count as having burned up. Okay, so this is phase 1, and it actually includes the transfer stage to get to Dres. It has all the fuel it needs to get there, circularize, and all the maneuvers to set up the comms network. Now I'm going to be using MechJeb to plan the encounters. It's not perfect, but again, I want to minimize the sort of amount of time I spend fiddling around in the map screen. I do like the note over there on the maneuver planner that says using this mode voids your warranty. I think that's hilarious. But anyway, we set Dres as the target, ask it to plan a maneuver, and it gives us this, that the dotted line is the planned maneuver. So it's not quite right. It doesn't actually meet up with Dres, or even its orbit, and that's because we are still going to need to make a correction burn to match planes and set up an encounter, or an intercept. I do like watching the trajectory change in the map screen as you burn. It's very interesting to see just how quickly the effects start changing. Okay, so that's really out there now. So again, I'm going to use MechJeb here to just sort of play around and try and fine-tune things. Again, it doesn't do things perfectly. I don't actually know why. So I'm going to have to fiddle around with this a little bit manually. But it's kind of good to show off how much work it is to get these in the right spot. We have to be careful when we're planning these intercepts, because we want to make sure that our different phases of the mission show up at the appropriate times. the comms network has to show up first, because otherwise our later stages are going to have problems. So it's not too bad, we just sort of have to just be careful while we're playing around. That's 1 year and 191 days from now, which is, yeah, that's probably reasonable. We can do a little bit more fine-tuning once we have that done. But that maneuver is not for, 160 days. So, yeah, we got some time. We're just going to watch Kerbal fade here in the background. This ship, this is not coming back, so it's going to say goodbye to Kerbal forever. Anyway, on to Phase 2. So Phase 2 is primarily for a rover. Rovers, they're another sort of divisive topic in Kerbal Space Program, and I will talk about that in a later video. But for now, this is our little rover. It's going to go into its own specialized deployment unit, which is big and overcomplicated for what it is, but it does have a secondary purpose of acting as sort of a ground relay for communications. This rocket is actually a little bit smaller than the first one. The rover and all its stuff is a lot lighter than all those satellites. This time we get kind of a nice sunrise launch early in the morning. Nice weather. Of course, there is no other kind in Kerbal Space Program. And here we go, we're gonna try and speed through this thing pretty well. There's not going to be a huge amount to say for this launch. A lot of the details are going to be almost identical to Stage 1. We're going to get this thing to a nice 150 kilometer orbit. We're going to ditch the launch stage. There we go. I'm not going to show deorbiting this one. The solar panels I've added to the launch stage actually mean I can come back, a long time from now to deorbit it. There is no need to do it right away. Speaking of solar panels, we really have to make sure we have them extended. I've had some permanent ones on Stage 1, but for Stage 2 I actually have these extendable panels. If you don't extend your solar panels and your ship runs out of electricity, you will no longer be able to control it, and it will basically be a waste. So yeah, definitely don't do that. Again, similar to Phase 1, this ship includes its transfer stage. It doesn't need a separate stage. It has all the fuel it needs for what it needs to do. Alright, I cut a lot of that out. So here I am being careful again, planning the encounter. So it was, 1 year and 191 days for Phase 1, but we launched that a week earlier, so call it, 186 days, 184 days? But 1 year, 203 for Phase 2, which is good. So that's going to give us a couple weeks leeway between the two phases arriving. It's actually just about perfect. And again, we'll just sort of wave goodbye to Kerbal here, never to be seen again. So this is the important one, Phase 3. This is the lander that is actually going to land on Dres with our crew. So it has a whole bunch of science experiments, landing legs, ladders, big solar panels. We're going to stick this thing on top of a much bigger rocket. This payload is definitely the heaviest. All the stuff we need for crew. So this is a big one. Now in the bottom right there you can see our crew, Nedry and Janmore Kerman. And they are a scientist and an engineer respectively. They both have skills that may come in useful on the mission, whereas I'm not bringing a pilot because the remote control modules are actually pretty much just as good as a pilot, as long as you do have a connection back to mission control, which is why that comms network is so important. In my first interplanetary mission to Duna, I only brought one Kerbal, and I was showing off that mission to my girlfriend, and she sort of admonished me a little bit for sending someone alone on such a long mission. So this time I sent two. They can keep each other company. This rocket definitely had a bit of a struggle getting into orbit, but it got there. And there we go, 150 kilometers. We're about to lose sunlight here, but since this is a manned mission, we should probably go out to make sure everything went okay. Janmore, our engineer, is going to do a bit of an EVA, and she's going to just sort of inspect the rocket for any issues. I should point out that this has absolutely no purpose in the game. There are no, failures due to unexpected damage. There's really no problems that could even happen. But it's kind of cool to do EVAs. And it's a nice view of the ship. Okay. Everything looks good. Let's get back inside. Like phase 2, we want to make sure we have our solar panels and antennas deployed. It's not as big of a deal on this ship. Because it has a crew, even if we were to lose all our electricity, they could still make some adjustments needed to get power back. But still, it's a good idea to always have your solar panels ready. Now, one big difference between this phase and the other two another big difference. This one has a crew, that's a pretty big one. The other big difference between this launch and the other two is that we haven't ditched our launch stage and deorbited it. And that's because it's not just our launch stage, it's also our transfer stage. It is what's going to take us to Dres. And actually, it's our return stage as well. It's going to bring us back. The problem we have is that we burn most of the fuel getting it up into orbit. So before we can get this thing on its way, we're going to have to run a refueling mission. So this is sort of a standard refueling rocket that I use for a bunch of different things. It's kind of ugly, and it's probably not the most efficient rocket, but it's very reliable, and really that's kind of the important part here. So in order to run refueling missions, there's a couple sort of skills you need to develop. And they can be a little bit tricky to master. So first off, you need to be able to plan an intercept between you and something that's already in orbit, which can be a little tricky. And then you also have to be able to dock two ships together. And this one can be really tricky. You have to be able to design your rocket to be balanced in order to maneuver it easily. And I use a mod for that. And then that docking indicator down in the bottom right is also a mod, because the game itself doesn't have anything quite that nice. And then once you actually do get docked, you need to transfer the fuel itself. And there probably is a mod that makes this easier, but I don't have it. So I'm kind of going to show off the annoyance that is transferring fuel. While I'm doing that, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about those two things, the intercept and docking. They're really important skills to master, because once you do that, the sort of flexibility, the different options you have for running missions really opens up. So just as an example, refueling means I can use this rocket here. If I tried to launch this full of fuel without having a refueling mission, the original rocket would have been gigantic, like unreasonably large, to the point that it probably would have had trouble flying. Doing two more reasonable, more manageable rockets is much easier than one gigantic, crazy one. As well, the same skills can be used later if you want to build a big ship in orbit, so you can add different pieces together, or just space stations, for example, are the same thing. You have to bring it up in pieces, intercept, dock them together. It takes a lot of practice, but once you do it, just the number of things you can do gets kind of out of control, to be honest. You can make some very, very cool stuff. Anyway, we're going to be about done with that. I think I've probably shown this off enough. At the end of the day, we have our ship, our Phase 3, all fueled up and ready to go. And at this point, it's again very similar to the other phases. We have to plan our transfer, and then actually make the burn, and then plan our correction burn later. It's kind of nice you get those offset trajectories just based off the different launch times. It's quite nice looking, to be honest. And there we go. And now, while we're waving goodbye again, part of this rocket is actually coming home, so we haven't quite seen the last of Kerbin. Before I go, I just kind of wanted to show off the mission as it stands right now. So you can see our 3 phases here. Phase 1, which is the satellites. We have phase 2, that's the rover and also the sort of ground station communications relay. And then phase 3, our lander with our 2 crew, Nedry and Janmore Kerman. And so they are on their way, again with those sort of offset staggered trajectories, which is kind of cool. And here, if we zoom out, we can just sort of see their trajectories again. And also their planned correction burns. You can see that red icon there is actually Dres at their intercept. I think I'll go through them again. 1. And then 2. And lastly, 3. So they're all planned to intercept later in the orbit as we go along, which is just perfect. And next time we will get to finishing this mission. Thanks for watching. See you later.